Good morning, everyone. We're going to allow time to come in from the waiting room before we begin the webinar. Good morning, everyone. We'll be starting right after 1 p.m. We're going to allow people time to come in from the waiting room. We're going to give everybody a couple more minutes to come in from the waiting room. Thank you for being here today. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Hello, I'm Mary Miller, Global Manager of Clinical Education and KOL Engagement. We want to thank you for joining us today for our webinar, The Essential Neurodiagnostic Assistant, Boosting Productivity and Building Your Workforce by Kristin Dehlin. Before we begin, I want to touch on several housekeeping items. This webinar is approved for one asset continuing education unit. To earn that credit, participants must attend the full duration of today's live session. Complete a brief post-webinar survey about your experience and provide your valid asset ID number. Be sure to check your email box over the next several days for an email from Cadwell Education containing that survey link. Today's webinar will include a live Q&A with Kristin Dehlin at the end of the presentation. Please submit your questions in the Q&A box at any time. We will be monitoring them throughout this session, and we will address as many questions as we can during the live Q&A. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Kristin Dehlin. Kristin is an EMU clinical educator at Cadwell with over a decade of experience in neurodiagnostics, specializing in EEG and long-term monitoring. She brings a strong clinical education background, supporting both adult and pediatric populations across a wide range of neurodiagnostic procedures. Prior to joining Cadwell, Kristin served as a national program manager at Ascension, where she led neurodiagnostic program initiatives and supported clinical operations. She also spent more than 11 years at Corewell Health, advancing the EEG technologist to long-term monitoring analyst and clinical education specialist. During this time, she gained extensive experience in epilepsy monitoring unit workflows, clinical care monitoring, and advanced procedures, and played a key role in developing a successful neurodiagnostic apprenticeship program. Kristin holds a master's degree in healthcare administration from Ferris State University and a bachelor's degree in health science from Grand Valley State University. She is credentialed through ABRET as a EEG T, CLTM, and neuroanalyst CLTM. Kristin is passionate about education, advancing neurodiagnostic practice, and supporting clinicians through meaningful and high-quality training and development. Please join me in thanking Kristin for leading today's session. Kristin, I will now hand it over to you.
Thank you for the introduction, Mary. I also want to thank all of you for being here today. I'm really excited to discuss the neurodiagnostic assistant role and the impact that I've seen it have firsthand for a department. I feel that today the neurodiagnostic assistant is more essential than ever for EEG departments in order to keep up with the growing demands and continued staffing gaps that are seen nationwide. My goal today is to provide meaningful information and ideas of how to implement this role. I'll discuss some of my firsthand experience and how this role can support staffing challenges, and also talk about strategies that I found helpful to make training more successful. A lot of the time, it is simply needing ideas of how to get started, and so I hope I can help provide some of that today. Incorporating a new role isn't always a straight line to success. I've lived it, so I can definitely speak to that. But my advice is to stay the course, make adjustments when needed, and connect with other people in the neurodiagnostic community that you can collaborate with, learn from, and create inspiration to think outside the box. The neurodiagnostic assistant role is actually the role that helped launch my career in neurodiagnostics. It wasn't called that at the time. I worked at Corewell Health here in Grand Rapids, Michigan, which is where I still currently live. I was the first iteration of this type of role for that department. I was working at the hospital as a nurse tech on the neuro floor. I had recently graduated from college, but hadn't discovered where I really wanted to land within healthcare. I'll say that I knew where I didn't want to land, but my original plan had changed in college, so I was deciding about going back to school when I discovered EEG by working on the neuro floor. I found the online program at IOHS, and I asked the director of the neurodiagnostic program at Corewell if I could do my clinicals in their department. After several conversations, he agreed and then also asked if I would like to join the department in a formal entry-level role to train while I was in the online program. There were actually two of us that started in that role at the same time. From that point, I completed the program, became an EEG tech who eventually helped train neurodiagnostic assistants who came after me, and then eventually managed and created training for the role as the clinical education specialist. This role definitely has a special meaning to me, and you'll see that I'm an advocate for it after having a front row seat in several different roles on the impact that it can have. Okay, let's dive into more of the details. These are the key takeaways that were listed for the webinar. So we'll talk about what an NDA is, some practical ways to incorporate it. Like I said, I'll share some of those strategies that I found helpful. We'll also discuss some next steps if you want to use the role to create a workforce pipeline. And as I said before, along the way, I'll share some of my firsthand experiences and also discuss how to evaluate what impact this role has for a department and why that is important. Before I advance to the next slide, I want to share that you will hear me refer to neurodiagnostic assistant as an NDA. After a few minutes, neurodiagnostic assistant becomes a mouthful and I start to trip over myself. So I want to say that in case you haven't heard the abbreviation before. So what is a neurodiagnostic assistant? This is a support role. It's designed to support the EEG tech and help to increase efficiency and productivity. It's an entry-level position. I like to say that it's similar to a nursing assistant or nurse tech. You know, they help complete those patient care tasks as part of a team rather than the nurse trying to accomplish all of that on their own. The NDA is a very similar role. It's cost effective, it's less hourly costs, and there's less training involved in order for them to be a productive member of the team. Asset does have a position statement online for the neurodiagnostic assistant role. The statement discusses job responsibilities, education, and experience. Job responsibilities they have listed include monitoring patients, restocking supplies, electrode removal, disinfection. When I was at Corewell, we did not utilize NDAs to do any sort of monitoring. And when I say monitoring, think of keeping the patient on the camera, ensuring patient safety, those type of things. Instead of doing that, we taught them to do all of those other non-interpretive tasks, including setting the patient up. They marked, measured, applied electrodes. We even had them start the study, and then the EEG tech was in the monitor room and they were able to pull that study up. What this allowed was EEG techs to be able to do that real-time monitoring. We were able to do more specs, WADAs, and other higher level tests. With my time at Cadwell, I've been to quite a few hospitals across the nation that do use a monitor tech. And so this is definitely an option for an NDA responsibility. Just wasn't something that I have a lot of experience with. But really it can help provide patient safety, especially in that EMU setting. NDAs are not qualified to analyze EEG data. You'll hear me say this a few times over the course of the webinar, but the most important thing to remember if you want this role to be successful and help to increase productivity is to stay within the determined scope of the role. This will look different depending on the site. If you identify those tasks, also think about how delegating those tasks to the NDA frees the EEG tech up. How does that change their responsibilities? So look at it through both lenses, not only what that NDA can take on, but what does that allow the EEG tech to then do? From a strategic impact, departments are able to accomplish more in a day much sooner than trying to recruit or train a full-time EEG tech, at least in a lot of locations. You're increasing productivity, you're able to increase revenue with that. Incorporating NDAs is done at a lower cost and requires a much lower bandwidth to train and use them for departmental growth. Importantly, this role is not a replacement for EEG techs. It is what I think this is a great term. It's a force multiplier. So some core responsibilities. Think of all those non-interpretive tasks that EEG techs do every day, a lot of which are time consuming. Those tasks add up and they consume valuable time. As I said, this role does not replace EEGs techs, but it enhances what they're able to accomplish each day. So thinking about from a patient care perspective, they can help with room setup, patient prep. Like I said, we taught them to do the patient setup portion of the test, lead fixes, discontinuing studies, and also monitoring for patient safety. From an equipment standpoint, they can help prepare equipment, cleaning, disinfecting, and stocking supplies. And then overall workflow support. So room turnover, streamlining those daily operations. I've seen where in the outpatient setting, the NDA can discontinue a patient. They can get that patient cleaned up, that room cleaned up, while another NDA or an EEG tech is starting to set up the next patient. And so it can really, really help with a lot of that turnover and workflow. This isn't a one size fits all as far as how they will support the EEG tech role, and I think that's one of the biggest advantages. As a department, you can utilize this role in a way that is most effective. So, current landscape and challenges. I don't think I need to go into great detail of the current landscape and challenges a large majority of neurodiagnostic departments are facing. Most likely you have or are currently experiencing some of these. I kind of put them into three categories here, looking at operational struggles. Most places are having a growing workload, increased complexity of situations or patients, and ultimately are being asked to do more with less. With that, a lot of places are continuing to have staffing shortages. There's recruitment challenges due to the limited staffing pipelines that a lot of locations have. So from that, you've got an impact on the staff, burnout, staff satisfaction, or rather dissatisfaction. I think it's hard as EEG techs when you're being asked to do more with less. You're not able to provide the care and the attention that all of us are, wanting to give those patients. The other thing that I think a lot of people are seeing, especially in the hospital setting, is retention issues. There's a changing landscape in what's available for EEG techs, which I think is great, but I think it really kind of adds to a lot of these challenges. When I started, I would have never imagined that there would be remote monitoring opportunities and those type of things. So I think it just adds another layer to some of those retention issues that a lot of places are seeing. And then the overall impact. I think one of the biggest things is when you have staffing shortages and there's an increase in how EEG is being utilized at different sites, it can really affect the quality of patient care that you're able to provide. So The time to complete orders or fixes increases. There are delays when patients can get in to even have an outpatient or an ambulatory study. Um, so how do we adapt when traditional staffing models aren't enough? Using the NDA role can help create a modern staffing strategy that can help adapt to meet the increasing demands in the neurodiagnostic space. With this type of staffing strategy, you can accomplish more in a day, and it's going to be an easier lift to get there. I can vouch that the NDA role can help at the bare minimum maintain, and most likely it's going to increase the level of care that you're providing to patients. And why is that? You're getting to tasks sooner. Those fixes, those DCs, even those orders. One of the things that we saw was we had a lot of long-term studies, EMUs, inpatients, and even, for the sites that are using collodion, their leads fall off. There are situations where more than one lead falls off. And so what happens is that really affects the integrity of that study. And it could be hours before somebody is available to get that lead or leads fixed. And so when you're able to have an NDA that's available to get that stuff done sooner, you're increasing the quality of that study. When you have an NDA that's working on some of those tasks, your EEG techs can focus on those higher level clinical tasks. They're going to be monitoring in real time more. They're going to be doing some of those higher level tasks that maybe you're not able to have right now. When they're monitoring real time, abnormalities and concerns are noticed much sooner, and therefore physicians are notified, interventions are occurring sooner as well. I will say that the NDA role doesn't take tasks completely away from EEG techs, but they help lighten the load in that same way that those nursing assistants help nurses. All right, so let's compare. I have a couple slides that compare using EEG techs only and then using a combination of EEG techs and NDAs. So we're going to pretend that a department currently has 3 EEG techs. They want to start doing maybe ambulatory studies, or maybe the inpatient demand is too high with the number of long-term studies that are being ordered. So on the left-hand side, this shows trying to increase from 3 techs to 5 techs. So what are some of the things we have to think about? We're going to most likely have some recruitment issues. So if we're not able to recruit any EEG techs to fill those additional 2 spots, what are some of the things that the next steps a lot of places take is they have to grow their own EEG techs. They have to train them themselves. And that's time consuming and therefore is going to be a greater cost. On the right side, a department decides to incorporate 2 NDA positions instead. I would argue that there's a larger pool to recruit for this role. It's an entry-level position. My advice is look within your hospital walls. There are a lot of people that are working in similar entry-level positions, nurse techs, cardiac monitoring techs. I've even had people that came from the food and nutrition department. And what you're doing is you're investing in people who are already employees at your hospital, and that has a lot of benefits. And some of the skills that NDAs are going to need, those individuals are already going to have those. Some examples would be infection prevention knowledge, other hospital safety information. They understand HIPAA compliance, navigating the electronic health record. And an additional thing is, just simply interacting with patients and family members. They've done that. They kind of understand some of the elements involved with that. I've also had people do well who have never worked at a hospital before come into the NDA role. They were definitely successful with training and eventually as an EEG tech. One of the things is that when you're just starting out, I encourage the path of least resistance and looking for ways to set everyone up for success by minimizing challenges, minimizing some of the training that needs to be done can really start to make a big difference. Um, anyway, going back to my example here, for the NDA positions, the training time is going to be shorter, and so there's going to be a lower investment for both time and money for that. So on this slide, I put together some numbers just to show some of the financial difference that these two scenarios could have. I tried to use easy numbers that worked well to display that. So don't focus so much on the numbers. My goal was to show a rough estimate. So again, on the left for EEG techs only, I used $25 an hour and showed the training costs for several scenarios, 6 months, 9 months, and 12 months. And you can see those are costly. Those definitely add up. You can see the cost per week with 5 techs, and I know that the first 3 techs are definitely going to be making, more than somebody that's coming in to be training in the role, but I didn't want to get in the weeds too much with that. For EEG techs and neurodiagnostic assistants, I used $17 per hour for that NDA. I showed the training costs for several scenarios. You can see 8 weeks, 10 weeks, and 12 weeks. And you can see the different financial, it's definitely more economical. One thing, and we'll get into this when we start talking about some of the different training options, is when I was the educator, for the most part, we were training NDAs in about 8 weeks. There were times when, we needed an extra week or two. The most usually was about 12 weeks that we ever had. So then I have the weekly cost if you have 3 techs and 2 NDAs there. So integrating the role into your workflow. Start small. Think of this as a pilot approach to help ensure success and build from there. The absolute first thing is to identify those high impact tasks that can be delegated to the NDA. Look at what are current workflow gaps or pain points that are present in some of the daily operations. Once that's done, once those things have been established, you can start to create a clear role definition and expectations that can be communicated to the team, to anybody who, is going to come into that role. One thing that I would encourage is to engage the team early. Having the team buy-in is key to this role being successful. Make sure they understand the goals of having this role. Again, this isn't a replacement. Make sure that you get their feedback and ideas, because that's an important part too, that maybe, some things that hadn't been thought of. They're going to be doing the training. They're going to be heavily involved in how this role succeeds. Encourage continuous feedback during the training and then after the training period is completed. My goal was always to make training not feel as overwhelming, and I'll talk about some of those things that I did to kind of lessen the load that's on EEG techs who are, trying to train people in these roles. So next we'll get into the training and mentorship. You're going to create a training plan. I absolutely emphasize consistency and structure. As I stated before, you're going to decide what task and scope will be included for the NDA that will be specific for what your site needs help with. Use that to create a competency checklist. I'll show you an example of one that I used. Something that I also found really helpful was to kind of create a week-by-week training plan. I'll show you something similar for that as well. When you have kind of the shorter training times, doing something like the week-by-week training plan can be really helpful. Decide on ongoing evaluations throughout the training process. Absolutely do this ahead of time. It could be at the 30-day mark and then at the 60-day mark, or it could be a weekly evaluation. um, I recognize that most departments won't have a dedicated educator, and that's why I wanted to share some of these details today. Creating these things, doing that first will help the team be more successful to integrate and train anyone into this role. I'll also go over some helpful tools. We talked about finding candidates that are already in the healthcare space, especially when you're first starting out. I'll show you some of the different mannequin heads and stuff to help with teaching them to measure, mark, and apply electrodes. I'll talk about a step-by-step guide I created for measuring and marking, and also a pocket handbook with some resources that we found to be, a helpful part of their training process, and also when they first started to be independent and on their own. Like I said, we'll discuss these in more detail, but overall, it's a small investment for training equipment and products. I think the most expensive cost will be the time that you put in to get everything together initially. Once that's built, though, it can really be a rinse and repeat situation. A lot of the products and material created can be reused. There might be some small changes that you need to make to the training for the next NDA. It's definitely a work in progress, but I saw that having a foundation and building and adapting from there made each new NDA stronger. All right, so some helpful tools. Uh, you know, there's a lot of options as far as, the glass heads, there's the styrofoam heads. Definitely, I used to get these from Amazon. I put the approximate cost on there. What I liked about these was that I was able to reuse these again and again and again for many an NDA training. One thing to note, I would use the thin washable markers and they would measure and mark. Somebody would double check that. The key to making these last is having them clean them off quickly. Otherwise, they will start to stain. Another thing that I've seen is people use the styrofoam heads, put the thicker Coban on, and then they can measure and mark right on the Coban. When they're done, when somebody checks that, they throw the Coban away, and then they can just re-Coban and practice again. The other thing I have here is just the blank head diagram. This helps them to learn electrode names and position. And again, it's just like a rinse and repeat, practice, practice, practice. One thing you can do is put it in a plastic sleeve that you can write on with those washable markers. So you're not printing and throwing out a ton of papers. Again, another option that can kind of make it easy. And then the next thing I did was, you know, I didn't do this all initially. This is stuff that I learned as I had NDAs coming through, as I was working on their training, is creating a step-by-step measuring guide. There are definitely a lot of resources out there, and maybe you already have some stuff built, but this helped them to go through the steps on their own, try to figure out if they were doing it correctly. They could practice at home. This was a double check for them. And, at the end of the day, um, I had them do the same steps every time when they were practicing. What that did, and they followed the guide. What that did was it helped create kind of muscle memory much sooner. And I was able to, watch them and know, oh, I can kind of see where things you maybe need a little help with this. The other thing is they got quicker much faster when they were using the same steps over and over and over. I always told them once they get to a point where they're good with measurements, they're accurate, they can do the steps in whatever method they want. But having that consistency initially was really helpful. I will say if you're looking at this and you see the error on there, I noticed this right before I was going through my slides. It says, I did a breakdown of everything, so it helped walk them through the steps. if somebody wasn't right there to help them. And then it would show an example of if the measurement from FP1 to O1 is 24, these are what your measurements should look like. If you can see that I have FP1 to O2, and I want to assure you all that that is not a measurement that I encouraged. So you see that. The next thing is the pocket handbook, and I just kind of named it that because it literally fit in their scrub pockets. It took a little bit of time to pull through, and again, not something that I initially created, but because we were having them do setups, um, and we did both adult and pediatric patients, there were just some really specific things. It felt like a lot of information. And so having that be something that they could easily pull out of their pocket and reference during training and when they were, initially on their own was really, really helpful. Some examples here is I have a list of medications, some of our like neonatal, like specific guidelines. We had both adult and pediatric patients, like I said, and the eye leads were placed differently. So just think about those things that are specific for your department that, I had the repeated questions that would come up, and I didn't mind the questions, but I started to think, what are some things that I can do to help them be more successful? And it's not just a pile of paper of protocols and different information. What I would do, think about if you fold a paper in half and you fold it again, it creates four sections. So let's say I would take the anti-epileptic medication one, I would put that on the paper 4 times, and then on the next page, I would do that with one of the other information here. We'll say maybe the eyelid placement, and then when I would print it front to back. And so I could laminate them, cut them. I would put a ring in the corner, and then they've got a laminated pocket handbook that is accessible for them. It can be wiped off, and that's something that you can reuse. So eventually they got to a point where they weren't using that anymore. I could use that for future NDAs that would come in. The competency checklist, create this checklist. This provides clear communication of the skills they need to be competent in. It also helps whoever's training them to know what the list is, maybe where they are, what they still need to work on. This is just an abridged version here. This is an example of something that I used previously. I had it kind of broken into different categories: equipment, EEG software, patient care, different patient types and situations. I also, on here, I did a 30-day formal check or evaluation, and then a 60-day or a final check. I think doing that check halfway through was really helpful to understand where people truly were in their training. It kind of better to identify issues or challenges sooner rather than later. This is also something that could be done weekly. I think it really just depends on the bandwidth of a department. But ultimately, this is what's going to help them be held accountable and to meet the quality of care standards that they need to meet. One other item that I used to help ensure kind of a higher, that they're meeting that quality of care, especially with their measurements, was the Averett measurement assessment form. I just printed this off Averett's website. I think it's great because it's really clear what the standard is. We started this in week 1, even with the mannequin heads. I think that, they really enjoyed being able to see their progress as well. And I think it helped them to visualize, oh, yeah, so my O's really need some help. And so then we would talk through some things that they could do to help ensure that their circumference was more accurate. Again, sometimes not everyone loves doing them. They can be kind of time consuming depending on in the outpatient world, this was more difficult to do because it's a tight turnaround from patient to patient. So but something that I think is a helpful tool. All right. I had mentioned creating a week by week training outline. Um, when the training is shorter, creating a more concise stepwise schedule can be really helpful. It can be really overwhelming when, they look at a large competency checklist. But with the weekly outline, the expectations are a little bit more clear. Kind of feels like, you're kind of taking a little bit of a bite off each week. Um, it's not a steadfast guide. You'll need to be able to pivot and make adjustments depending on the trainee or the situation. But I think it's really helpful, by week 3 or 4, I already had an idea if we needed to kind of maybe extend training by a week or two. The other thing that's really nice is you can see there in the blue, I have, you can start to sign them off on certain skills. So starting to kind of peel back the layers a little bit or let the leash out a little. Um, I think that that really helps to create confidence. And they start to do things independently, but they still have a support system because they're still training. They have somebody that maybe they're not with them in that moment, but they have easy access to them compared to being done with the 8 weeks or 9 weeks. They're suddenly on their own completely and they've never, they haven't been doing anything on their own at that point. So starting with some of those really easy bucket items, right? They can stock, they can clean equipment on their own. I've signed off that they can put in patient history and medication lists on their own. And then at the next week, we've discontinued a lot of studies. I've watched them. They're competent and do that independently. And they can start to do that as the weeks go on and build that confidence. So, some strategies for training. As I said before, I recognize that not all departments have a dedicated educator to manage this type of training. And maybe they can even create a step-by-step measuring and marking guide. One thing that could help with that is Course 202 from the Asset Core Curriculum courses. If you aren't familiar, Asset has an online curriculum consisting of 13 courses. It says on their website that they equip educators and students with the tools they need to succeed without the time-intensive and costly venture of creating an entirely new curriculum. Asset also states that among other important benefits, it also provides a viable solution to short staffing for a growing number of hospitals and epilepsy monitoring units. If you don't have the bandwidth to create or have someone, really walk the NDA through that step-by-step measuring, this can be an option to help with that. You can buy the courses as a set, but you can also purchase them as individual courses. So the cost for an individual course, I don't have the exact numbers, between 200 and 300. I think it depends if you are a member or not, the exact price. But I think all of that is listed on the website. This course would need to be purchased for each NDA you're training though. The material, can't be shared due to copyright rules. There's quizzes and tests, and those are things that each NDA would need to complete in order to get the completion certificate. The other thing is maintaining consistency. Assigning new NDAs to consistent trainers or mentors ensures a stable and effective learning environment. I know, I know that that may not be an option, but trying to create some consistency, even if it's a week at a time or 2 days at a time, I found to be really, really helpful. Not only for the NDA, because there's a comfort level there, but with the person that's training, they're able to pick up on some of those things, that this is an area they're struggling with, or they're doing really well with this. They can do that independently. Where if you're switching the trainer every day, some of that is going to get lost in, kind of between the cracks, we'll say. I know that in healthcare, things change every day, people call in sick. But as much as you can, if that consistency is an option, I absolutely recommend it. The other is monitoring progression. Talked about this a little bit, but decide how best you're going to monitor that, their training. Decide that ahead of time. This can allow for, recognizing if their skills are plateauing. Um, I've been doing that final competency check for someone, and I realize that there's a skill, or maybe there's several skills that they're not meeting. And or maybe that's a skill that they should have been competent weeks before. So it's, can feel like a huge setback. Feels like you're almost starting over in some of that. And now all of a sudden you have to add 2, 3, 4 more weeks of training because that wasn't assessed in a early enough. So building a workforce pipeline. You have an NDA, or maybe you have several NDAs, but ultimately you need to grow them into EEG techs with the department growth that, you've decided upon. Maybe you're adding EMU rooms, you're needing to do ambulatories, those types of things. Um, the NDA is a great entry point into the field. By having this role, you are creating an internal recruitment pathway, which is a huge strategic advantage. So, what's the best way to get them trained in order to be an EEG tech? One thing that I really love is when you have a fully trained NDA, all of those tasks that they need to know are tasks that they would need as an EEG tech. They're already competent in those. So the work to get them to that next step to an EEG is much less. They're really just focusing on pattern recognition at that point, right? Maybe there's a few skills here and there depending on the site, but you can start to help them take that next step as they're already a productive member of your team. I like to say it's truly like having a 40-hour clinical week. There are several options available, and it will depend on resources. It's important to compare options, prices, and really know what resources you have available that will adequately support the NDA to take their training to the next step to be an EEG tech. Know that if you try one thing, you can pivot. Maybe additional resources become available, or maybe, that type of training didn't work well with what you have going on and what your needs are still from a weekly basis for that NDA. So one of the things is a KHAP accredited neurodiagnostic program. There are online programs. There are some lucky few out there who have a program that's local to them. These are obviously a higher cost, but when have an NDA, I can speak to doing the online program. I also had the apprentice students who were doing the program, and it was totally feasible to work full time as an NDA and do the program. A lot of it is because they knew, they had a lot of that knowledge already. The other option is using those asset core curriculum courses. I have helped NDAs use this to become an EEG tech. One of the challenges with this is, I was a dedicated educator at that time, and I was able to kind of help with creating a structure around that. Otherwise, it is really kind of independent for them to work through the lessons. But it's great, great material. It's cost effective. I would think a comparison to some of the other accredited programs would be like a quarter or a third of the price compared to that. So really a great place to get started if needed. Some departments, they're already, have done some independent training within their department. So that's obviously a definite option. I didn't include that on here. And then the other thing is an apprenticeship program. So this is approved by the U.S. Department of Labor for use in a registered apprenticeship program. Because it's recognized by the Department of Labor, there's options for grants and those types of things, which are really helpful. Um, I there's definitely not enough time to really go into extensive detail because it is kind of complicated, but partnering with your local community college or a program to do that. The other option is we really relied on our local and state workforce development program. They are the ones that really helped with some of the grants and the partnership with the community college. I've seen NDAs use every one of these paths to become EEG techs. I don't want to say that one was necessarily better than the other because they were all used in different circumstances, and there is a good fit for all of these options depending on the site. So some real world success. You can probably tell I could talk for days about the neurodiagnostic assistant role and the success that I've seen. I truly have seen firsthand the measurable difference and change that this role was allowed to be accomplished every day all around. What I didn't share at the start of the presentation was that when I started in neurodiagnostics as a NDA, even though it wasn't called that, I became the 13th tech in the department when my training was complete. When I left, I was the clinical education specialist for a team of 55 techs. So from lucky number 13 to tech number 55, the majority of those staff were originally NDAs. Even if they weren't called that, they went through various types of training to be an EEG tech. Some of that was an online neurodiagnostic program. Some of them used the Asset Core curriculum courses. There were some other in-house training that we tried before landing on the formal apprentice program that was created. So there's a good chance that most departments don't want to increase by 42 techs. But what I do hope is that this helps show the impact this role can have for a department. And I will say that this growth was probably like 7 to 8 years. And if you do incorporate the NDA role, identify what went well with training and what improvements would be helpful. Address how to incorporate those improvements or changes moving forward. You might not get it right the first time. I definitely didn't, but with each time, I was able to improve how that training looked. It was an opportunity to learn and to grow, and that's exactly what happened in order to go from 13 to 15. So measuring the impact, I absolutely really encourage tracking before and after metrics. Choose the indicators that you would feel that you feel would be beneficial. Some of those could be, tracking the number of studies per week that you're able to do with prior to having the NDA and then after the NDA. Look at turnaround time from order time to study completion, turnaround time for fixes. Are you able to reduce your overtime? Does the patient experience, do those indicators get better? One of the other things is look at your wait list for outpatient EEGs or your EMU. We had times where it was booked out months and we were able to bring that back down. Another indicator that I don't have spelled out on here, but revenue can be really helpful to kind of capture, if you're increasing the number of studies that you're doing, maybe you're able to bill for monitoring differently, right? Because you have more resources available. Tracking these metrics can be helpful to get additional NDA positions approved or for looking at the next steps of using NDAs to create a pipeline. If you can prove, some of these metrics, maybe that can help cover cost of a program or the asset core curriculum courses. With that, you can also look at adding additional services. And so having metrics that can show the impact will truly be crucial. So circling back to those key takeaways, I hope that you are able to see how the neurodiagnostic assistant can really make a difference that can be measurable and impactful for efficiency, productivity, and increasing the quality of care that you're able to provide for patients. Small changes can create a meaningful impact. By just starting with one NDA, you can start to see a difference, and over time, that can continue to build. I think what I like most about this role is how sustainable and scalable it can be. It can help provide a solution to address many challenges so many departments are facing. And also, each department can customize how this role enhances the work and care that they provide. Thank you so much for joining today. I really appreciate your time. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you have questions. I'm happy to collaborate. I'm happy to, be someone you can bounce ideas off. I truly have seen so many different scenarios trying to incorporate this role, to train people in this role. And so I, would love to be that sounding board if needed. I'll turn it back over to Mary and we can see if there are any questions.
Thank you, Kristin, for sharing your insights with us today. Now we're going to transition over to the Q&A. If you haven't already, please share your questions in the Q&A box below. We're going to have about 10 minutes to answer those questions live, and we will get to as many of them as possible. If you aren't able to get your question answered today in our live session, we will definitely follow up with you after the webinar ends. So Kristin, you do have several questions in the box below. I see about 6 ready for you. Would you
Okay.
like me to read them too, or would you like to go ahead and start answering them?
I think I can start answering here. I have them pulled up. So
Perfect.
thank you, Mary.
You're welcome. Thank you, Kristin.
So Mason, the first question here is, was it only productivity increases seen when including NDAs in your practice, or did patient outcomes increase as well? I don't have any true specific stats around this at this point. I will say that overall, we were able to provide just a much quicker and more efficient care to patients. And so I think it ebbed and flowed over the years, but ultimately, I do remember that we did start to see an increase in those patient outcomes. All right, next question. Do you think being an NDA would spark some interest for them to become a technologist in the neurodiagnostic field? Yes, absolutely, Teresa. We saw, I talked about bringing, people in that already worked in the hospital. So we had some people that came from the cardiac monitoring unit, maybe some nurse techs that came from some of the floors. And what happened was not only were they interested, this is before we really had the formal apprenticeship program. Not only were they interested in becoming EEG techs, but people that they knew that they previously worked in were introduced to the field as well. And so it was a really great pipeline in that way that we were introducing that to people as we were trying to grow the workforce. Okay, Will, do you see a difference with staff retention by having NDAs? Definitely. I mean, we weren't able to build from 13 to 55 without, retaining techs and the NDAs as well. I think overall, it really it changed the work that we were doing on a daily basis. I think we were a level 4 epilepsy center, but we were able to do an increasing number of specs and WADAs and surgical patients. And as an EEG tech, I can say that that was exciting. It was nice to be a part of that. And so I think that also really helped not only decrease the burnout we were seeing, but offering some of those additional services, people were interested in staying there. Um, so, Mason, what are some of the biggest hurdles when trying to convince decision makers to bring this role into a department or clinic? Um, I think that, there's a lot of unknown with that, with, bringing in a new role and understanding the impact without actually doing it. And that's why I say kind of start small, start with one, track those metrics and, you know, show, put some numbers together. I put that slide together that can show, the financial difference. And if you have NDAs, your techs are able to do, X, Y, and Z. And unfortunately, a lot of what we do in healthcare, there's a financial component to that. So if you can put some of those things together to help those decision makers, I think that's a really great place to start. Are there any safety concerns from an administrator's viewpoint with using an NDA? And are there any courses or lectures the NDA may benefit from taking? This is from Amy. Um, you know, I I think when you create a competency checklist and you have those training um, documents and process, they're held to a standard. And so just like any other role, there aren't safety concerns as long as you're tracking that and you're ensuring that they meet those competencies and those standards. Um, any courses or lectures the NDA may benefit from taking. I think the first thing that comes to mind is really, some of those asset core curriculum courses. There's a lot of great material in there that 202 can kind of help give them an understanding. There's some other courses, and I can't think of them off the top of my head. But I think there's some resources there as well. Gosh, the questions keep coming. Okay, I just was checking the time, sorry.
You're doing great.
Um, okay. How do you feel like the training is different or better by using someone in the NDA position compared to just bringing someone in and training them or converting other staff MAs to be a tech? So I think traditionally, some of those traditional staffing models is that if you are needing to bring somebody in and train them on your own to be an EEG tech, one of the challenges is that it takes a long time to do that. And so when you bring them in as an NDA and you get them competent in those skills, they're they're a real, I mean, I can't stress how it can really help your productivity. And so from there, continuing on, it's just lowering the load that you're having to do, that your staff is having to do with training, looking at it in a really stepwise way. All right. If you're using the NDA for hooking up EMU patients, are you billing the CPT for the hookup education takedown versus 95700 since they are an assistant versus technology? We did not bill any different. And I have not, I will say I have left that role. I'm trying to think of, it hasn't been a ton of years, but I know that there were some CPT changes. So, Sean, let me look into that and just make sure that there isn't anything that I'm unaware of since I've been separated from the hospital setting a little bit, and I can follow up with you on that. Maria said, sometimes I had trouble with the measurements since math isn't too easy or as quick while practicing EEG. Any helpful tips? I kind of created a little document. If you think about, 20 centimeters, 21, 22, you go down and you start to look at a little chart where it's 10%, what is 10% of 20 centimeters? What's 20%? What's 25, 50%? And that can really help you to learn some of that math. I definitely had NDAs where doing some of that math just wasn't quick and easy, but with practice, using that chart to kind of look at those and be like, oh yeah, I'm confident that 20% of this is that. So that's something, and feel free to reach out to me. I'd be happy to share that, Maria.
I think we have time for one more. Kristin?
Okay. Teresa says, do you recommend that NDAs have patient care experience? Do you know if asset guidelines suggest this? Um, I'd have to double check, but I don't believe that the asset position statement, necessarily says that that's a requirement. I do think it can be really helpful. And like I said, when you're getting started, you're trying to get somebody in that role, having that can really, really help. But it's not required. I've had people be really successful. I don't want to say I pulled them off the sidewalk, but who didn't have that previous patient care experience and they did really well. And so um, I think that it really depends on the person.
I
Thank you
agree.
guys so much for all the questions and engagement. I really appreciate it.
Yes, and thank you, Kristin, for leading today's session. We appreciate your insights on the essential neurodiagnostic assistant, boosting productivity, and building your workforce. I also want to thank everyone who joined today's session. We appreciate you for sharing your time with us. As a reminder, please look forward to an email from Cadwell Education with a link to the post-event survey in order to earn your CEU credit. If you have any questions about today's session, or you're interested in scheduling a demo with one of our dedicated representatives, please reach out to marketing@cadwell.com. Or if you have additional questions for Kristin, you can also reach her there. Have a wonderful day, and thank you all for joining today. Thank you, Kristin.
Thanks.